Welcome to China Forum, where leading experts discuss important topics regarding China and the U.S.-China relationship. Today, we are excited to announce the start of a special series, China Forum Conversations with Ambassadors. In this series, we will be interviewing various former U.S. ambassadors and chargé d'affaires to China about their lives, careers, and U.S.-China relations. Understanding our past diplomatic relationship with China and learning lessons from the ambassadors who helped shape it are vital for ensuring strong diplomacy and effective China policy in the future. We are looking forward to recording and sharing this series with academics, policymakers, universities, and more to help strengthen our collective understanding of U.S.-China relations and diplomatic history. Today, we are honored to be joined by Ambassador Chaz W. Freeman, Jr. Ambassador Freeman spent 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service. He served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, earning the highest public service award of the Department of Defense. U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Ambassador Freeman was Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires in the American embassies at both Bangkok and Beijing, was Director for Chinese Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, and was the principal American interpreter during President Nixon's path-breaking visit to China in 1972. Outside of Foreign Service, Ambassador Freeman has served as Chairman of the Board of Projects International, Inc., Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council, Co-Chair of the U.S.-China Policy Foundation, President of the Middle East Policy Council, and Chair of the Committee for the Republic. His numerous publications include Interesting Times, China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige, The Diplomat's Dictionary, and Arts of Power, Statecraft and Diplomacy. Ambassador Freeman is currently a visiting scholar at Brown University's Swanson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Welcome, Ambassador Freeman.
Thanks, Ariane. Good to be with you.
It's great to have you here with us today. Let's just get right into talking about U.S.-China normalization and your experiences. So, Ambassador Freeman, you had a long career in the U.S. State Department and chose Chinese for your language study. What originally drew you to the Foreign Service and to China more specifically?
Actually, it was China that drove me into the diplomatic service rather than the other way around. I was at the Harvard Law School, became disillusioned with the idea of practicing law, went to the library and started reading history, read around the world until I came to China, became increasingly fascinated, and I began to think, this was the mid-'60s, the United States would have to reach out to China. We were under pressure from the Soviet Union. China had dropped out of alliance with the Soviets, and I thought we would need to achieve rapprochement with it, and I wanted to be there when that happened. So when I came in the Foreign Service, I asked to be assigned anywhere on the rim of China, except, of course, India. And having ruled out India, I was naturally assigned there. That's what they do. And then I began the study of Chinese at the Foreign Service Institute after basically fighting my way into the program. They didn't want to put me in it, but I did okay.
Thank you so much for that background information. When you began your career, the Cold War was still underway, and the U.S. had previously experienced the Red Scare and McCarthyism. And then Dr. Kissinger makes a secret trip to China in July of 1971. Can you share your experience working on China during this time period and witnessing the shift in policy and approach to China?
Well, one had to tiptoe around the idea of any kind of normal relationship with what was then called Red China. And in fact, we were not supposed to use the word Peking to refer to Beijing, but to say Beiping, which was the nationalist Chinese name for the capital of what they called the bogus regime on the mainland. And this was a matter of political correctness, a legacy of McCarthy and Dulles and U.S. Debates over, quote, who lost China, unquote, as though it had been ours to lose. In any event, I began working on China in a period when we were totally estranged. But I was elated when President Nixon, who had argued in a foreign affairs article that we needed to reach out to China, appointed Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor. Kissinger was the author of a book called A World Restored, which was about dealing with the aftermath of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars and reincorporating France into a stable European state system. I thought there were enormous parallels to be seen with what we would have to do with China. And so I expected, when Nixon took office, a fairly rapid evolution in our China policy. That didn't happen. Nixon was politically cautious, and while he began to send signals to the Chinese, they were mostly not public. So there was a period when I began to doubt that I had read the situation right.
You mentioned Nixon's article about China. President Nixon had been seen as a staunch anti-communist, and yet he ended up being the president to go to China, and he wrote this article and instituted these changes. What do you think caused this shift?
Nixon was, of course, as you say, he had been quite opportunistically anti-communist from the beginning of his political career. But he was also a statesman. He had traveled extensively around the world. He understood foreign policy, geopolitics very well. And he saw the merits of keeping China as an active participant in the balance with the Soviet Union. In fact, shortly after he was elected, he startled his cabinet when he came in and said, we can't allow the Soviet Union to humiliate or conquer China, which was a statement that the rest of the cabinet found baffling. But he was looking at the Sino-Soviet skirmishes on the border, both in Heilongjiang province in China, and that's the Soviet maritime provinces, and in Central Asia in Xinjiang. And he saw the possibility that the Soviets might attempt to re-subjugate China, reincorporate it into their sphere of influence. And that made him think, this is something we need to prevent. And I think that was the impetus for his decision to make such an effort to break through decades of isolation in the two countries and reach out to Beijing by sending Kissinger there. I was aware of the intention to send an emissary before it happened because I was tapped to be the interpreter at the Warsaw talks, which were ambassadorial level talks in the Polish capital that had been going on for quite a while. And in preparation, I went up to the embassy in Taipei, which was where it was at the time, and read the record of the Warsaw talks. And the last Warsaw talk had approached the Chinese with such a proposal, and it had also offered the basic formula that we used later to finesse the Taiwan question. So I was expecting a special emissary, and when I was called back to Washington suddenly to work on all sorts of briefing papers, which I was never told what they were about. I knew what they were about, but I didn't know who would be the special emissary. And I was a bit surprised when it turned out to be Henry Kissinger.
So after Kissinger's trip, there was then, of course, the lead up to President Nixon's own visit. Can you talk about that process, your role, the attitudes that you were seeing, and the hopes for the visit?
Well, this opening had been structured very strangely in order to preserve confidentiality. Nixon basically didn't trust the State Department. He was using Kissinger and the then rather small National Security Council staff as sort of the foreign ministry for great power relations. and leaving the rest to the State Department. William Rogers, the Secretary of State, was an old friend of Nixon's, but not someone whose foreign policy knowledge, expertise, or reasoning he particularly respected. So he ran everything out of the White House.
You were with the State Department at the time.
Indeed, though I will explain. There is a normal mechanism for communication between the State Department and the White House, which goes through the Secretariat, which is the Secretary of State's office. The communications for this bypassed that. So basically, I wrote papers which were then bootlegged to an unknown person, namely Kissinger, by the head of the China desk. And the NSC staff, which at that time on China consisted of Ambassador John Holdridge and Dick Solomon, both of whom unfortunately now deceased, would take those papers and lightly edit them perhaps, but basically retype them so they looked like they were their own work.
Oh, wow.
This later led to the invention of something called the State Department briefing paper stationery, which was intended to thwart that effort to take credit for things that the State Department or Foreign Service people at the State Department had actually written. So this was a process that was under the table, largely. In the preparation for the Nixon visit, I was essentially locked in the operations center in a special little group for almost 2 months. I'm told I wrote almost half of the briefing papers.
Oh, wow.
President. At the last minute, I was asked to write a briefing book for Pat Nixon about other things, Chinese culture, arts, and sciences, and that sort of thing. And I did so relying heavily, I must say, on a wonderful guide to China that the Swiss publisher Nagels had put out. So I plagiarized freely from that. But anyway, I was very heavily involved in the preparation. I was getting probably 3 hours of sleep a night, and the rest of the time writing and thinking and trying to provide the basis for a knowledgeable dialogue with people that very few Americans then knew.
The Kissinger trip had been made public by this point, so there must have been some discussion or some sentiment that you were hearing about, reopening with China.
Well, I think there was there were mixed feelings. In effect, the left in the United States had long objected to almost to the farcical notion that the government of China was located in Taiwan. Taipei was represented in the Security Council until 1971, after the Kissinger trip. And their arguments had been that we needed to recognize the reality of the Chinese Revolution. There was a bit of romanticism in the far left about Mao Zedong and his writings. Can't say I ever shared that. In any event, the right wing saw the strategic merit of trying to enlist China against the Soviet Union to bolster the containment of the Soviet Union, which eventually fulfilled its author, George Kennan's reasoning, which was that if the Soviet Union were walled off, it would eventually collapse of its own defects. So that was skeptically received, but received on the right. There were people who were diehard anti-communists or who had been involved with Chiang Kai-shek or with McCarthy who were opposed. But the dominant mood was favorable.
Thank you. So before we talk about Nixon's trip itself, what was your first impression when you landed in China?
Well, I had lived for 2 years almost in another part of China, Taiwan, and learned the Taiwan dialect as well as Mandarin while I was there. I had read read the People's Daily and other Chinese publications daily, and had read the revolutionary operas and other things, and certainly read Mao Zedong's writings. So, in one sense, I was well prepared for that reality. In another, this was like going back to the 1930s. This was a country that was a cultural desert as a result of the Cultural Revolution. Nobody was writing or reading anything. It was backward, primitive. It was isolated internationally. I remember arriving in Shanghai for the refueling and taking aboard a Chinese navigator to go to Beijing, and being struck by the presence of a sign at the airport that said in Chinese, "We have friends all over the world." The same sign, by the way, with one different character, was at the Taipei airport. But this was an airport where you could hear the birds sing. So clearly those friends weren't arriving in China by aircraft.
Oh, wow.
And it was a bit eerie. On the other hand, the Chinese leaders whom we met, and I spent a fair amount of time with Zhou Enlai and other senior people, but did not meet Mao Zedong. Those leaders were almost entirely from Mandarin upper class backgrounds, well educated, sophisticated. Certainly Zhou Enlai fit that description, but the others at the senior level did as well. And the interesting contrast, was the people in Taipei, comparable people, were of lower class background. They were sort of lower middle class. These were China's historic educated aristocracy, even though they were leading what they called a proletarian revolution.
So during President Nixon's trip, you served as principal interpreter. I'm sure you have some interesting stories about that experience.
Well, I was the principal interpreter for Nixon only at the dinner table or the luncheon table. He didn't have much small talk. And I ended up spending a fair amount of time talking to Zhou Enlai, and who was a little bored with Nixon's absence of small talk, and others, Ye Jianying, Li Xianyan, other great figures in the pantheon at the time, and Xia Guanhua, who was the brains in the foreign ministry, as well as with Ji Pengfei, who was the acting foreign minister. But the formal interpreting I did was for the Secretary of State. And this is very interesting. Usually summits are structured so that the chief of government, the president, gets to talk about the future and areas of agreement with his opposite number. And the Secretary of State and the foreign minister argue about the disagreements. And it was essential that we do that. We needed to reestablish and reaffirm our respective positions on issues like the division of Korea, the division of Indochina, the situation in Kashmir, the role of Japan in the region, because each of us had to reassure our allies or partners that we had not sold them out. And so therefore the Shanghai communique begins with several pages of recitation of sharp differences between the United States and China. That was the substance of the Secretary of State's talks. That's what I interpreted. It served a useful purpose, because having stated all of our differences, we then went on to say that notwithstanding these differences and the differences in our socioeconomic systems, we both regarded it as in our interest to cooperate. So that was that.
So can you explain a little bit more the importance for back home of having these differences as part of the Shanghai communique? and then maybe go more into the importance of that document itself.
Well, obviously, one purpose that the recitation of differences served was to reassure opponents of the opening, both in China and the United States, that their leaders had not sold them out, that we had remained faithful to our previous positions. Of course, that wasn't entirely true, because in effect, the United States had extended protection to China against a possible Soviet attack or humiliation. This was a shock to Japan, our principal ally in Asia, and it was unnerving to the Soviets. There was a possibility, which we all recognized, that the Soviets would overreact and reduce their willingness to compromise with the United States. In fact, the opposite happened. They became more conciliatory. They did not want to see China outflank them in a relationship with the United States. So I think from the point of view of domestic politics in both places, we handled the opposition. Nixon's visit was televised. Of course, I was there. I didn't see that, but although you can see me in the television reels from the time. What was revealed to the American people was a China that was very different than the one that they had come to imagine. And there was a sort of shock of acknowledgement, recognition that this was a more complex place than Americans had imagined, that Chinese were not necessarily the regiment of blue ants, that meaning people dressed in blue boiler suits, that Americans had imagined, and that there was a great deal more to China than they had thought. So it opened the way for further education after the trip to try to consolidate the opening.
And so then what was the major accomplishment of the Shanghai communique? So we discussed the discussion of differences, but what was actually agreed in that document?
Well, there was an agreement, as I said, that notwithstanding serious differences on particular issues arising from the Cold War, for the most part, and notwithstanding differences in ideology and political and economic systems, we would cooperate to counter an effort to impose hegemony. And that meant essentially the Soviet Union, but it also implied not allowing Japan to pursue hegemony again as it had in World War II. So that was the first agreement. The second agreement was to finesse the longstanding obstacle to U.S.-China relations, which was our disagreement over the Taiwan issue. The Taiwan issue is a question of what relationship Taiwan, formerly a province of the Republic of the Qing China, and again the Republic of China when it was located in Nanjing, what political relationship should it have to the rest of China, if any? The United States, on June 27, 1950, had interposed the Seventh Fleet in the Taiwan Strait to prevent the continuation of the Chinese Civil War, to prevent Mao Zedong's forces from crossing the strait to attack Taiwan, or Chiang Kai-shek to counterattack the mainland from Taiwan, to which he had retreated after his defeat on the mainland. So we didn't want the Korean War to spread. We put the fleet in there. And this suspended the Civil War for most purposes. It did not end it. And it is still unended. So we went through crises in the 1950s over Quemoy, Matsu, and other offshore islands. The United States became progressively involved in support of Taipei against Beijing. This ended. The Shanghai communique ended that. And the United States acknowledged that basically Chinese on both sides of the strait, whether they were in Taipei or Beijing, all thought that there was only one China. Taiwan was part of China. And the United States promised not to challenge that position. We also finally agreed to the progressive withdrawal of our armed forces on Taiwan, which had been placed there during this period since June 27, 1950, as peace in the area progressed. Now, that might have meant peace in Vietnam. It might have meant a lowering of tensions in the Taiwan Strait. But in any event, we undertook to withdraw all our military forces and installations from Taiwan. And we did when we finally normalized relations with Beijing 7 years later.
I imagine when you're dealing with two different cultures and languages that are very different, there are a lot of nuances. Can you touch on the importance of, translations and how language is handled?
Well, interpreting, which is oral translation, is a very demanding art, not just because it requires an exceptionally good memory as well as a command of a language, but also because you are dealing with exactly the issue you raise. That is to say, no two languages have a complete identity in their wording. A word in English and a word in Chinese may overlap quite a bit in terms of their significance, but they're never identical. And the problem was exacerbated in the case of Chinese and English because in the 19th century, Western languages, and English being a premier example of that was part of this, went through an effort to remove value-laden words from scientific discussion. Chinese did not go through that. So Chinese words very often express a positive or negative attitude rather than neutrality. So I'll give you an example. If you use the word to defect, meaning to change sides, in English that's neutral. You could be defecting to the right side or the wrong side. In Chinese, it's touchang, to defect to the right side, or todi, to defect to the enemy side. So it's either positive or negative.
Oh, wow.
And we had an argument, I had an argument with the Chinese interpreters over a couple of interesting nuances. One had to do with the word deterrence, which of course means to intimidate people against taking action. I used the word 贺阻力量, which was the Taiwan version, directly taken from English. The word on the mainland was 威慑, which means to threaten and intimidate. So I asked the interpreter, would you use this word to describe China's foreign policy? She was using it to describe ours. And she said, of course not. We're not threatening anybody. And I said, well, that is a problem. And it took the Chinese about 30 years to come up with a neutral term, which they finally did at the Chinese Academy of Military Sciences. And the term is 摄止, meaning to intimidate, and 止 meaning to halt, which is a pretty good translation. We also had a disagreement over the question of what are parallel policies. In mathematics, parallel is 并行不悖, meaning two lines that extend equidistantly and never meet. But in foreign policy, parallel policies represent a common objective. So I translated this as 异途同归, to reach the same result by different paths, which my Chinese counterpart actually rather liked. This was a beginning, and our final note is, of course, even though I had studied the language in use on the mainland, I'd spent 2 years in Taiwan speaking Mandarin, and my Chinese was heavily laden with Taiwan terminology, and the best I could do to adopt mainland terminology was not good enough. So we were talking different versions of Chinese to some extent.
Thank you. So after you returned home from China, what was the reception like after the trip?
Well, I was asked by the president to do something that had not been possible for years, namely to go to American university campuses and propagandize, defend, promote the policy. Nobody from the executive branch had been able to go to universities because of the Vietnam War and student opposition to it. But I was pretty well received. And I gave over 100 talks, including one at the president's alma mater on his behalf, Whittier College in California. And I think people did appreciate the explanation for the reasoning behind the change of policy and some realism about China. Now, I have to say that the history of Sino-American relations, which go back really to the 1830s, is one of mutual misunderstanding and wide swings in mood. And I was very interested to see the difference between liberal Americans who were somewhat horrified as they encountered China and its political regimentation, and right-wing Americans who liked the fact that when they went into a classroom, all the kids had short hair and stood to attention when the teacher entered, and were very disciplined. And of course, China was, as I said earlier, not at all what Americans had imagined. So after the trip opened the way for congressional visits to China, and the beginning of some kind of commercial relationship. And Americans began to visit China as tourists or for business. This was an eye-opener for Americans. And I think the Chinese they spoke with were also taken aback by the Americans they encountered, who were not the demons they had imagined.
After Nixon's visit, U.S.-China relations were in an interesting period. Rapprochement had begun, but official diplomatic relations had not yet been established. What were some of the challenges presented by this unique period and ways the relationship was approached?
One of the things we were deeply concerned about was to insulate the relationship that we had begun from political upheavals in China. So this led to the suggestion of an exchange of liaison offices. These were concrete, both literally and figuratively, manifestations of the new relationship. After a while, 1973, it was agreed that we would do that.
A new idea, or had it been done before?
There had never been anything called a liaison office in diplomatic history, which was one of its great merits. Nobody could tell what it portended. Some people could imagine that it forecast normal diplomatic ties. Others could imagine that it was just what it was, a means of communication. Anyway, in 1973, I was part of the small team that opened the U.S. liaison office in Beijing, and it was a good thing that we did that. The Chinese, of course, opened an office here, and I was the principal liaison with their team when I came back from Beijing. Much to our surprise, the first political upheaval wasn't in China. It was here, with Nixon's Watergate dismissal from office, impeachment, and resignation. This brought to power Gerald Ford, who inherited Nixon's commitment to normalize relations with China, but lacked the political clout to be able to carry that off. And of course, Ford was defeated in 1976 by Jimmy Carter. On the Chinese side, there was also a political upheaval. Investment in liaison offices turned out to be a very useful thing.
It wasn't immediate that official diplomatic relations were finally established. It wasn't until 1979 under Carter. What did it take for this to actually happen?
Basically, it took the return of political stability and authority in Washington and Beijing. In Washington, Jimmy Carter was elected and was firmly in charge of the government. In China, after the confusion of the Gang of Four and their arrest, and a brief period under Hua Guofeng, Deng Xiaoping took the reins. And in 1978, the Carter administration, concerned about Soviet activity and advised by a very anti-Soviet Polish nationalist, Zbigniew Brzezinski, accelerated the effort to normalize with China. On the Chinese side, Deng Xiaoping had two reasons to want to move toward normalization. One was, of course, that the Soviet Union and Vietnam were colluding in what looked to China like an effort at encircling it from the south as well as from the north. And China felt it needed to dissuade Vietnam from continuing to build its own Soviet-backed empire in Indochina. So Deng Xiaoping had the idea that he would give Hanoi a lesson, perhaps a whole curriculum of lessons, using force. And he wanted the appearance of American backing, and normalization provided that. But the second and far more important reason, which we really didn't appreciate at the time, was that he had decided in many respects to dismantle the elements of the Soviet system and Mao's innovations in China and move to join the rest of the world, to adopt market economics, to look at best practices international and adapt them to Chinese realities. And so at the third plenum of the 11th Party Congress in December 1978, he pursued both these objectives: approval for war with Vietnam and approval of normalization with the United States. And beginning in 1979, he actually went to war with Vietnam, which worked. That is to say, despite a much higher military cost than he had anticipated, the war revealed many weaknesses in the People's Liberation Army. And the Vietnamese, of course, at that time were with no doubt, I would say they were the world's best infantry. So they gave the Chinese a really hard time. But the political objective of dissuading Vietnam from continued reliance on the Soviet Union and empire building was achieved. Of course, with the United States, Deng, after normalization, sent the children of the Chinese elite to be educated in the United States. And in many ways, the two societies converged economically, although not politically. China never offered to or was interested in changing its political system. What it was interested in was modernizing its society and economy within the parameters of Communist Party rule. So that is exactly what Deng set off. And in the succeeding 40 years, China registered astounding progress in both its economy and in its social openness.
To start off normalization and official relations, Deng Xiaoping visited the U.S. Can you touch on the planning, significance, and reception of that trip?
Deng's visit was essential for both the purposes that I mentioned. That is, to give the appearance of an American endorsement of his actions against Vietnam that would keep the Soviet Union off balance, and also to start the opening of ties, normal ties between Washington and Beijing. It was also a public relations triumph. Here was this little man who put a cowboy hat on in Texas, and some of his blunt charm and ability to cut through the crap and go directly to the essence of problems was observed by Americans, and he became a rock star in our media. And that really helped to consolidate normalization, which was, of course, being attacked by proponents of ties with Taiwan at the time. So the preparations for Deng's visit included, of course, the logistics, the management of the visit, but they also included two other things. The beginning of a process of reaching agreement on foundational documents, treaties, agreements, executive agreements, programmatic memoranda that would produce the kind of normal relationship the two countries might have had if we had not had 3 decades of estrangement. The second element of it was to manage the abnormalization of relations with Taiwan, meaning to keep the substance of our ties while giving up the formal aspects of them, the official aspects of them. Taipei sent a brilliant diplomat here to negotiate, and he actually ended up getting much more for Taiwan than anybody had been prepared to yield on the American side. But of course, it wasn't enough for people in Taipei, and he was roundly castigated for having failed. In the end, diplomats have a major unfortunate utility in that we're often most valuable as scapegoats when it's discovered that aspirations are unrealistic and cannot be realized.
Looking back on the years since then, what would you consider the legacy of U.S.-China normalization?
Well, this is a process that began with a cynical strategic move to offset Soviet power.
Right.
When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, it posed a challenge to the direct interests, geopolitical interests of both China and the United States. And China, from being a sort of protected state, meaning a state whose existence was geopolitically important to the United States, became an entente partner, meaning a limited partner for a limited purpose, which was to oppose the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and the annexation of Afghanistan into the Soviet bloc that it implied. So the relationship changed from passive to active. Several things happened. The United States developed a very close intelligence relationship with China, which included the establishment of listening posts on Chinese territory aimed at following Soviet troop and naval movements and at watching Soviet weapons development in Central Asia. This is a program that became quite robust. Second, the Chinese began to help the United States by selling us weapons for use by the Afghan Mujahideen, in addition to having their own program. And in 1987, which was the peak year for that cooperation, we spent $613 million on Chinese weaponry for the Mujahideen. And finally, the Chinese supplied us with Soviet equipment. They manufactured MiG-21s in Chengdu and taught our pilots how to fly them Soviet style so that we could practice for the war that blessedly never came. with the Soviet Union. So this was a relationship that was strategically extremely important. And when Carter was defeated by Ronald Reagan in 1980, Reagan came in with the idea that he would essentially restore the pre-normalization relationship with Taiwan and downgrade relations with Beijing. When he found out about the levels of cooperation I just described, he abandoned that thought. So this proved to be a very important anchor in the relationship. And by the way, it also accounts for George H.W. Bush's reluctance after the Tiananmen student and worker uprising was put down to break relations with China or to cease communication with China.
Right.
He wanted to retain these very valuable elements of the relationship, which were unknown to the public at the time.
Mm-hmm. So what lessons can diplomats and policymakers today learn from the process of normalization?
Well, I think there's some obvious lessons. One is that you can seldom go wrong by recognizing reality and accommodating yourself to it, even if it is not what you would like. And that is what the United States finally did with China after 2.5 decades of trying everything else. We are, in fact, famous for eventually doing the right thing after exhausting all the alternatives. So that is the first lesson. The second one is that it's important to sustain communication, whether with an enemy or with a friend. If you don't sustain communication, you risk strategic surprise. But a corollary to this is that it's not always better to talk than not to talk. Sometimes not talking is a form of negotiation. And you shouldn't talk unless you know what you're going to say and what it might result in. And the third lesson, perhaps, if I'm up to 3, is that when you put events in motion, you can't tell where they're going to end. Nobody imagined in 1971-72, when we were deeply concerned about Chinese weakness, vulnerability, and isolation, that 50 years later, we would be concerned about the opposite.
Right.
China's strength, connectedness, and wealth and power. China has become, much to everyone's surprise, a very competitive part of the capitalist world. Some people have joked and said that it was necessary for the United States to save China from the Soviet Union and for China to save capitalism from itself. In any event, you can't tell how events will proceed. In that connection, there's one thing that I find very interesting. I met Deng Xiaoping in 1974 when he came to the United Nations. He'd temporarily been released from a detention, only to be detained again later on. But he was obviously a remarkable man. He had worked as a very young man in France. He was actually one of the founders of the Communist Party there, and was very familiar with France after World War I and early 20s, as well as with the predictions of classical Marxism and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union about how France would develop. In 1974, after visiting New York, he went back to France, to Paris, and he could see that the predictions that Marxist ideology had made were complete nonsense. Something very different had happened. And he began to think about that. And I think this had a great deal to do with his decision to de-Sovietize and to some extent de-Maoify China and to join the rest of the world. And he set in motion trends that transformed global politics, transformed the global economy, raised 800 million people from poverty, and made China, once again, a powerful force for leadership on the planet. Not bad for government work.
Thank you so much for sharing these stories with us today. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today, but we're looking forward to covering more of your career and your insights next time when we meet again.
Thank you, Ariane. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We'll see you next time on China Forum.